The jagged edge of a rusted iron nail on the bucket's handle caught the meat of Clara's palm, slicing a shallow but stinging line across her skin. Blood, bright and sudden, welled up to mix with the gray, freezing lye water sloshing over the brim. But she didn't cry out. She couldn't. To make a sound in the great hall of Whispering Pines at dawn was to invite the wrath of Mrs. Gable, a woman who measured a servant's worth by her absolute invisibility. Clara pressed her bleeding hand into the folds of her faded gingham apron, her breathing disciplined and shallow. Through the frost-rimmed window, the Appalachian blizzard howled, a reminder that the wilderness outside was deadly, but the tension inside these walls was far more perilous. Clara stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the sharp ache in her palm ground her. She was surrounded by the cold, towering grandeur of the Vance family homestead, a massive structure of hand-hewn oak logs and river stone that had stood for over a century. To the locals in this isolated stretch of West Virginia, Whispering Pines was a fortress of wealth, but to Clara it was a maze of secrets. She picked up the heavy wooden bucket with her uninjured hand and carried it toward the servants' kitchen. Her boots made no sound on the wide plank floors. She had learned to walk like a shadow over the past 3 months. In the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, boiling chicory and fried salt pork. The other hired girls from the valley were gathered near the massive cast-iron stove, but the usual morning chatter was entirely absent. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence hung over the room. The source of their collective dread was pinned directly to the oak pantry door. It was a crisp sheet of parchment, a stark contrast to the rough timber behind it, covered in the narrow, rigid handwriting of Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper. Clara stepped closer, her damp hands folding behind her back with a natural grace that she constantly tried to hide. Most of the new regulations were mundane, a tightening of the reins meant to reassert control over a household that had felt adrift since winter set in. There were new schedules for polishing the brass oil lamps and strict curfews for the kitchen fires. But the final entry on the page stood alone, separated from the rest by a thick, dark ink line. Under no circumstances is any member of the household staff to approach, feed, or speak to the master's Wolfhound, Blue. His care remains the sole province of the head groom. Any infringement of this rule will result in immediate dismissal without character or pay. Clara read the words twice, her expression remaining an unreadable mask. She could feel the eyes of the other maids drilling into her back. Young Mary shifted nervously from foot to foot, while older Agnes gave a small, sharp-edged smirk of satisfaction. They all knew who the rule was for. It wasn't for Mary, who shrieked and dropped her trays whenever the massive beast bounded into the courtyard. It wasn't for Agnes, who crossed herself and muttered prayers whenever a great gray head appeared at the window. It was for Clara. Blue was a creature of mythic proportions, a giant of shaggy iron-gray fur with eyes the color of winter twilight. He was an Irish wolfhound, a breed rare in these mountains, brought to the valley by Silas Vance's younger brother, Ethan. When Ethan died tragically in a logging accident up on the ridge 6 months ago, Blue had transformed from a loyal companion into a grieving, unpredictable force. He refused to hunt, growled at the grooms, and bared his teeth at anyone who dared approach the empty leather collar hanging in the barn, except for Clara. From her first week at the homestead, the hound had recognized something in her, perhaps the shared quiet dignity of a creature carrying a heavy unspoken sorrow. A heavy rhythmic thud echoed from the back porch, followed by a low, mournful scratch at the wood. The kitchen girls scattered like startled quail, leaving Clara standing alone near the door. The latch rattled and the door nudged open just an inch, pushed by a massive wet black nose. Despite the strict warning glowing in fresh ink just 3 feet away, Clara did not move away. She couldn't. Blue squeezed his immense frame through the gap. He was terrifyingly large, his back reaching the height of Clara's waist, his coat tangled with bits of dried briar and frozen mud. He ignored the trembling maids and walked straight toward Clara. The room held its breath. If Mrs. Gable walked through the pantry door right now, Clara's mission at Whispering Pines would end before it truly began. She needed this job. She needed access to the house, specifically the master's private library, where the forged land deeds that had ruined her father were surely hidden. To be dismissed now meant losing her only chance at justice. "Go on, Blue," Clara whispered, her voice a soft melodic breath that barely carried across the room. "You shouldn't be here." But the wolfhound did not leave. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound deeply human in its grief, and sank to the floorboards. With absolute submission, he rested his massive shaggy head directly across her worn leather shoes, pinning her to the spot. He became her gentle shadow, a fierce protector, acknowledging a master of his own choosing. Clara looked down, her heart aching for the animal. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small leftover piece of morning cornbread she had saved, and slipped it into his mouth. Blue took it gently, his tail giving a single heavy thud against the floor. Suddenly, the heavy pine door at the far end of the kitchen swung open. The maids stood rigid as statues. It wasn't Mrs. Gable who stepped into the room, but the master of the estate himself, Silas Vance. Silas loomed in the doorway, his tall, rugged frame framed by the gray light of the oncoming bow toot. He wore a heavy wool flannel shirt, high leather boots caked with snow, and carried the scent of pine resin and bitter cold. His face was weathered, his jaw set in a permanent line of grim endurance. He was a man who spoke rarely, ruling his vast timberlands with an iron will, a mountain man who had buried his youth along with his brother. Silas's dark eyes swept the kitchen, instantly landing on the scene by the pantry. He looked at the fresh notice on the door, then his gaze shifted downward to his brother's wild, untouchable Wolfhound, who was currently curled like a lamb at the feet of the quietest maid in the house. Finally, Silas looked up, his piercing stare locking directly onto Clara's face. Clara did not look away, nor did she tremble. She met his gaze with the calm, unbroken dignity of a woman who knew exactly who she was, even if the rest of the world saw only a servant. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind outside. Silas's brow furrowed, a flicker of profound curiosity passing through his severe features. He didn't yell. He didn't call for Mrs. Gable. He simply watched Clara, noting the strange, educated composure in her posture and the way the fierce hound softened under her silent presence. Silas opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped. He turned on his heel and strode out into the storm, leaving the kitchen door swinging in his wake. Clara let out a slow breath, knowing that while she had survived the morning, the master of Whispering Pines was now watching her every move, and her nightly searches in his library were about to become infinitely more dangerous. The sting in Clara's hand faded to a dull throb as the morning slipped into a relentless rhythm of labor. While the snow piled against the heavy timber walls of Whispering Pines, she moved through the drafty rooms with her mind fixed entirely on the task that had brought her to this isolated mountain ridge. To the household, she was merely Clara, a quiet girl with a tragic lack of local family and an unusual grace that made her an awkward fit for a maid's coarse uniform. But beneath that calico dress beat the heart of Clara Whitley, a woman fueled by a quiet, burning desire for justice. Her father, Professor Arthur Whitley, had been a man of books and quiet honor, spending his life documenting the early history of the Appalachian frontier. When he passed away the previous autumn, the world Clara knew collapsed. Richard Gable, a smooth-talking country lawyer from the valley, had stepped forward with a flawless, legally binding will that stripped Clara of her childhood home, her father's modest savings, and his life's work. It was a masterpiece of forgery, enacted so swiftly that Clara had been left with nothing but a trunk of old clothes and a sharp, intuitive suspicion. She knew her father had been cautious. Weeks before his death, fearing Gable's rising influence in the county, the professor had shipped 3 heavy wooden crates containing his most valuable original land patents and private diaries to his oldest, most trusted friend, the late patriarch of the Vance family. Those documents were the only proof left that could expose Gable's fraud. Silas Vance, the current master, had inherited the estate, but seemed entirely unaware of the historical treasure buried within his home. To find those papers, Clara had to infiltrate Whispering Pines, hiding her education behind a veil of absolute silence. As night fell, the blizzard outside grew into an unyielding beast, rattling the thick glass panes and burying the homestead in a suffocating shroud of white. By midnight, the grand house had grown quiet, the embers in the great hall fireplace dying down to a faint orange glow. Clara slipped out of her small servants' quarters carrying a small brass oil lamp. Her movements were fluid and soundless. Blue, the massive wolfhound who had spent the evening resting near her door, rose silently to his feet and followed her like a great protective shadow. The library of Whispering Pines was located in the oldest wing of the house, a vast room that smelled of aged leather-dried cedar and tobacco smoke. It was a space that belonged to the past, filled with thousands of books and hand-drawn maps collected by generations of the Vance family. Clara pushed the heavy oak door open, and Blue immediately took up a position just inside the threshold, his ears twitching as he kept watch over the dark corridor outside. Clara set the lamp on the sturdy trestle table, its warm light casting long dancing shadows across the rows of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. For weeks, she had been systematically searching the lower cabinets and forgotten storage trunks looking for her father's distinctive handwriting. Tonight, her fingers brushed against a thick leather-bound ledger hidden behind a collection of early territorial laws. She pulled it out, her heart quickening as she recognized the faded crest of the University of Virginia on the inside cover. She was so absorbed in the pages that she didn't hear the floorboards groan. She only realized she was no longer alone when Blue gave a soft, vibrating huff from the doorway, his tail giving a brief, tense thump against the floor. Clara froze, her hand resting flat against the open book. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed from the darkness of the doorway. Silas Vance stepped into the circle of lamplight. He had discarded his heavy winter coat, wearing only a dark wool vest over a white linen shirt, but his presence was no less imposing. His dark eyes locked onto Clara, glinting with a dangerous mixture of suspicion and cold authority. "The kitchen staff usually stays in their quarters after midnight," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. He stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the valuable academic ledger beneath her hands. "And they rarely have a taste for archival records." A lesser woman would have dropped to her knees pleading for mercy or spinning a clumsy lie about looking for a rag to clean the dust. But Clara simply closed the book with a deliberate, unhurried motion. She rose from her chair, her chin held high, meeting his severe stare with absolute composure. "I was not looking to steal your property, Mr. Vance," Clara replied, her voice smooth and devoid of the rough local accent she usually forced herself to speak with. "I was reading. Your collection of early historical manuscripts is remarkable, though the translation on page 47 of this particular volume is severely flawed." Silas stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing deeply. He stared at her as if seeing her for the very first time. "You can read. My father ensured I was well educated," Clara said softly, her eyes never wavering from his. "The passage describes the original 1790 boundary dispute along the ridge, but the translator confused the old French-Latin legal terms for surveyed timber and sovereign grant. It changes the entire legal context of the territory." Silas remained silent for a long moment, the severity of his features slowly shifting into a look of profound astonishment. He was a mountain man, accustomed to isolation and the simple, rugged realities of survival. But he was also a man who deeply respected intellect and truth. He looked at the maid standing before him, a woman who possessed the mind of a scholar and the quiet majesty of a queen, all hidden beneath a servant's apron. "Who are you, Clara?" Silas asked, his tone losing its harsh edge, replaced by a genuine, intense curiosity that seemed to pierce through the armor she had built around herself. Before she could answer, the distant, muffled sound of a door slamming downstairs echoed through the house, followed by the heavy, familiar voice of Richard Gable arguing with his sister in the lower hall. The sudden intrusion broke the fragile spell between them. Silas glanced toward the door, his jaw tightening as the cold reality of his household returned. He looked back at Clara, his eyes holding a silent, unspoken understanding. "Go back to your room," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a strange protective weight. "We will finish this conversation when the storm clears." Clara nodded, picking up her lamp and slipping past him into the shadows, with Blue following closely at her heels. She knew she hadn't found her father's papers yet, but as she walked down the dark corridor, she realized something fundamental had changed. Silas Vance was no longer just her employer. He was a man who had begun to see the truth, and tomorrow, when the storm reached its peak, that truth would be tested to its very core. By dawn, the blizzard had transformed the world outside Whispering Pines into an impenetrable fortress of white. Drifts of snow reached the sills of the first-floor windows, completely burying the mountain roads and cutting off the estate from the rest of the county. Inside the grand log homestead, the air was heavy with a different kind of storm. The claustrophobia of being trapped together amplified every hidden malice, and by the time the household gathered in the great hall, the tension was palpable. Clara moved through her morning duties with an iron resolve, though her mind was constantly replaying the midnight encounter in the library. Silas Vance's piercing stare and his unexpected question, "Who are you?" Clara hung over her like a promise of either salvation or exposure. She knew she had crossed a line, but she also knew she had touched something genuine in the stoic mountain man. Yet the luxury of contemplation was brutally cut short when she entered the great hall to revive the dying embers of the stone fireplace. The room was already occupied. Mrs. Gable stood near the massive cedar dining table, her posture rigid with a dark, vindictive energy. Beside her stood her brother, Richard Gable. The lawyer looked distinctly out of place in the rugged mountain home, his expensive wool coat damp from the draft and his fingers nervously adjusting his gold-rimmed spectacles. He had spent the previous evening trying to pressure Silas into signing away a valuable tract of timberland, and his failure had left him irritable and desperate.
"There she is!"
Mrs. Gable hissed, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a rusted blade. "The quiet one who sneaks around like a thief in the night." Clara stopped holding her iron poker tightly, but keeping her expression perfectly calm. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable. I'm only here to tend to the fire." "You won't be tending to anything in this house much longer," the housekeeper sneered, stepping forward and slamming a heavy fist onto the table. "My brother and I have just discovered a grave offense. The master's antique gold pocket watch, the one left to him by his grandfather, is missing from the parlor mantel, and young Mary saw you wandering the upper corridors long after midnight." Richard Gable stepped forward, a predatory smile touching his lips. "As a legal representative of this county, I take theft very under advisement, young lady. Whispering Pines has no room for criminals. Hand over your apron and your coat. You are leaving this mountain immediately." The other hired girls began to filter into the hall, whispering and drawing back in horror. To be thrown out into an Appalachian blizzard without a coat or references was an absolute death sentence. No one could survive the 3-mile trek down the mountain ridge in this blinding whiteout. Clara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, not because she feared the storm, but because she realized the Gables were using this fabricated charge to eliminate her before she could find the proof of their fraud. "I have not touched the master's watch," Clara said, her voice ringing out with a clear, steady resonance that startled the whispering maids. "And you have no authority to dismiss me, Mr. Gable. Only the master of this house can do that. I have all the authority I need when it comes to protecting this estate from a common thief." Richard shouted, his face reddening, as he reached out a heavy hand to grab Clara's arm and drag her toward the heavy timber front door. Before his fingers could brush her sleeve, a massive gray shape lunged from the shadows near the stairs. Blue materialized with terrifying speed, his iron-gray fur bristling as he placed his immense body directly between Clara and the lawyer. The Wolfhound bared his teeth, letting out a low, vibrating growl that shook the very air in the room. Richard Gable leaped backward, nearly tripping over a heavy oak chair, his face turning a sickly shade of white.
"Get that beast away from me!"
the lawyer shrieked, his voice cracking with terror.
"It's mad, it's gonna kill us all."
"The only madness in this room is your own, Richard." The deep, commanding baritone cut through the chaos like thunder. Silas Vance stood at the top of the grand wooden staircase, his tall frame clad in a dark wool vest, his hunting rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He descended the stairs slowly, his heavy leather boots making a deliberate rhythmic thud against the wood. His dark eyes were fixed on the Gables, burning with a cold, unyielding fury that made the raging blizzard outside seem mild. Silas reached the foot of the stairs and walked directly into the center of the room. Blue immediately stopped growling, though he remained firmly at Clara's side, his intelligent winter twilight eyes locked on the trembling lawyer. "Mr. Vance," Mrs. Gable stammered, trying to regain her composure, though her hands shook beneath her apron. "This girl, Clara, she has stolen your grandfather's gold watch. We caught her red-handed, and my brother was simply enforcing the law of the household. She must be removed before she steals anything else." Silas stood perfectly still, his weathered face an unreadable mask of stone. He looked at Mrs. Gable, then at Richard, and finally at Clara. For a long, agonizing moment, the hall was so quiet that the crackle of the fireplace sounded like gunshots. "My grandfather's watch," Silas said softly, the dangerous quietness of his voice more terrifying than any shout. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a gleaming, heavy gold pocket watch attached to a thick silver chain, and laid it deliberately on the cedar table. "The watch has been in my personal iron safe since yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Gable. I placed it there myself." A collective gasp rippled through the gathering of servants. Mrs. Gable's jaw dropped, her face draining of all color as she realized her trap had completely collapsed. Richard Gable swallowed hard, backing away toward the corner of the room, his legal confidence utterly shattered. Silas stepped closer to the table, his gaze dropping to the lawyer's trembling hands. "Furthermore," Silas continued, his voice rising with a hard, unyielding authority. "Miss Whitley was in the library last night by my personal invitation. She is a guest of this house, not a thief." Clara looked at Silas, a profound wave of relief and gratitude washing over her as she heard him use her true family name in front of the entire household. He had not only protected her life from the deadly storm, but he had also chosen to validate her dignity against the cruelty of her enemies. Silas turned his severe stare back to the gables, his jaw tightening into a grim line. "The storm will break by tomorrow morning," he said, his words falling like iron weights. "And when it does, the two of you will answer for more than just a missing watch. I suggest you go to your rooms and begin packing your bags." As the gables retreated in humiliated silence, Silas looked back at Clara, a silent, unspoken understanding passing between them. The trap had been avoided, but the real confrontation, the one that would decide the fate of her father's legacy and the future of Whispering Pines, was waiting just beyond the clearing of the storm. The storm that had buried Whispering Pines for 3 days finally broke as the sun climbed over the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Ridge. The blinding whiteout dissolved into a pristine, silent wilderness, where the heavy snow on the ancient pines glistened like shards of glass under a brilliant blue winter sky. Downstairs in the grand living room, the atmosphere was just as clear and unyielding. A roaring fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting a warm amber glow across the rough-hewn oak walls and the heavy cedar table where the final judgment of the Vance homestead was about to be delivered. Silas Vance stood by the hearth, his tall, rugged frame perfectly still, though his dark eyes held the terrifying weight of a mountain storm. Sitting at the table, completely stripped of his usual legal arrogance, was Richard Gable. His hands trembled as he adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, his face pale and slick with sweat. Beside him, Mrs. Gable sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the floorboards in absolute humiliated silence. The household staff gathered near the doorway, watching from the shadows, while Blue, the massive iron-gray wolfhound, stood like a stone sentinel right beside Clara. "The roads are being cleared by the logging crews as we speak, Richard," Silas said, his deep baritone cutting through the quiet room like the strike of an axe. He placed a thick, weathered hand onto a heavy manila envelope resting on the cedar table. "And before the sun sets, a rider from the county seat will arrive with the sheriff. I didn't spend the last 3 days merely watching the snowfall. I sent one of my most trusted men out on horseback before the worst of the Bao Tuyet hit. He returned an hour ago with the official land registry records from Virginia." Richard Gable swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he tried to find his legal footing. "Mr. Vance, whatever you think you found, I assure you everything was handled within the strict boundaries of the law. Professor Whitley's will was fully notarized." "The will you presented to the court was a masterpiece of forgery, Gable," Silas countered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that caused Blue to bare the tips of his teeth in silent agreement. Silas opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of crisp official documents, sliding them across the table. "My father was a meticulous man, and so was Professor Arthur Whitley. Before he passed, the professor didn't just ship his research crates here for safekeeping. He sent a registered letter of bailment to my father detailing every single original deed, land patent, and academic manuscript in his possession. I found that letter in my father's private desk last night." Silas stepped closer to the table looming over the terrified lawyer. "The university archives in Virginia have confirmed that the signature on your document does not match the professor's legal hand. You forged the deed to his estate, you stole his savings, and you used your sister's position in my house to ensure that anyone looking for the truth would be eliminated. You systematically ruined an honorable man's legacy, and you attempted to sentence his daughter to death in a mountain blizzard to cover your tracks." Clara stood with her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, her chin held high with the absolute, unbroken dignity of her heritage. Hearing Silas lay bare the truth of her father's honor felt like a heavy shroud being lifted from her soul. The long months of scrubbing floors, of hiding her mind behind a veil of silence, and of enduring the cruel slights of the Gables had finally led to this moment of absolute vindication. "I have already drafted a full confession and a formal restoration of property," Silas announced, pushing a piece of parchment and an inkwell toward the lawyer. "You will sign it right now, restoring the Whitley estate every cent of the stolen savings and the rights to the professor's research to his rightful heir, Miss Clara Whitley. If you sign, I will allow you to leave my mountain before the sheriff arrives to execute the warrant. If you refuse, you will spend the rest of your days in a state penitentiary." With shaking fingers, Richard Gable grabbed the quill. He didn't look at his sister, nor did he look at Clara. He simply signed his name to the document, his ruin completely finalized by his own hand. Silas snatched the papers away, checking the signature before handing them directly to Clara. "Your father's honor is restored, Miss Whitley," Silas said, his severe features softening into a look of profound, breathtaking warmth as he looked at her. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Clara replied, her voice smooth, melodic, and thick with emotion. "Justice has finally found its way up this mountain." True to his word, Silas banished the Gables from Whispering Pines the moment the logging wagons cleared the lower ridge. By afternoon, the homestead felt lighter, the suffocating atmosphere of malice entirely replaced by the clean, crisp mountain air. The other servants returned to their duties with a newfound respect, no longer seeing Clara as a quiet maid, but as a woman of profound substance and lineage. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow-capped Appalachian peaks in brilliant shades of pink and gold, Clara walked out onto the grand wooden porch. She wore her thick wool winter coat, her eyes tracking the beautiful, pristine landscape. Blue trotted beside her, his long, shaggy tail giving a contented thump against her legs. The grief that had haunted the giant hound for months seemed to have dissolved, replaced by a quiet, enduring peace. The heavy front door opened and Silas stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching softly on the light dusting of snow. He stood beside her, his rugged profile silhouetted against the winter sunset. For a long time, they simply watched the mountains together, sharing a comfortable, deep silence that spoke louder than any words. "The wagons are being prepared to take you back to Virginia tomorrow, if that is what you wish," Silas said quietly, his gaze remaining on the horizon. "Your home is waiting for you, Clara." Clara looked down at the restoration papers in her hand, then up at the majestic pines surrounding the homestead. "My father's house is in Virginia, Mr. Vance, but his heart was always in these mountains, documenting the truth of the people who built them." She turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with absolute clarity. "And I have learned that a house is just wood and stone. A home is something entirely different." Silas turned his head, his dark eyes holding a vulnerability that the rugged mountain man had never shown to another living soul. He reached out his large, rough hand, gently capturing hers, his grip warm and steadfast against the winter chill. "The silence of Whispering Pines has been too heavy for too long," Silas said, his voice thick with an unspoken devotion. "I spent years guarding this mountain, thinking that solitude was my only law. But you changed that, Clara. You brought light back into this library, and you brought peace back to my brother's hound. I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay here, not as a servant and not just as a curator of the past, but as my wife, as the mistress of Whispering Pines." Clara did not feign surprise, nor did she look away. She met his gaze with the same quiet majesty that had first captured his attention under the dim light of the oil lamp. A soft, radiant smile touched her lips, transforming her severe, dignified expression into one of pure, unrestrained happiness. "Silas," she said, speaking his name with a gentle warmth that seemed to melt the remaining winter frost between them. "I've been waiting for you to ask." A genuine, breathtaking smile spread across Silas's weathered face, erasing the years of grief and isolation in a single moment. He didn't kiss her. Then it was not the way of a stoic mountain man, but he pulled her hand close to his chest, holding it right over his beating heart. Blue, sensing the final peaceful resolution of the house, came and rested his great shaggy head directly against their joined hands. Looking at the man beside her and the loyal hound who had seen her truth all along, Clara knew that the shadows of the mountains had finally been filled with a love that was patiently sought, deeply earned, and justly found. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city or state you are watching from and what this story made you feel in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our new heartwarming tales.